The history of the Florence Cemetery begins before there was a Florence, a Kentucky, or even a United States of America. With the birth of Samuel Glassford Sir, he was born in Virginia in 1759, the same year that the French established the first village in what would become Kentucky on the banks of the Ohio River. Glassford later moved to Boone County and is buried alongside his son, Samuel Jr., and his daughter-in-law, Sarah.
A few years later, in 1766, Bartlett Graves was born in Virginia to a wealthy family that had been in America since the Jamestown colony. When Bartlett, a future American soldier, was just a year old, a young man named George Washington began the first survey in Kentucky.
Another future resident of Florence was born in 1775. The historically named John Marshall, that same year, explorers of Kentucky named their settlement after the site of the shot heard around the world, Lexington, Massachusetts. In 1784, just after the Revolutionary War, the first statehood convention was held in Danville to discuss the separation from Virginia. The second and third statehood conventions were held the next year, around the same time that Bartlett Graves moved his family to what would become northern Kentucky.
Bartlett's first wife, Frances, was pregnant with their second child in 1792 when Kentucky became the 15th state in the Union. Frankfort became the capital and the legislature approved United We Stand, Divided We Fall as the state motto. Bartlett Graves became a member of the state legislature in 1805. It was also the same year that the Bank of Kentucky was organized and authorized to issue paper money. When the War of 1812 started, Graves became a major in the U.S. Army. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war in 1814, and Graves returned home to become High Sheriff of Campbell County. Adam Finch and his first wife Mary moved to the Florence area in 1828. 2 years later, the city of Florence was incorporated. It included 5 acres of land and a population of 62 residents.
In 1840, Adam Finch built a house on Bannock Lake Street, which is now the oldest standing house in Florence.
When the Civil War broke out in 1861, residents of Florence and Boone County fought for both sides. David Osborne worked at a carriage shop in Florence with his brother before the war. He chose to fight for the Confederacy, joining the Kentucky 2nd Regiment, also known as the Orphan Brigade. At Fort Donelson, he was captured and received a leg wound that would bother him for the rest of his life. Buford Bohannon was an African American who signed up to fight for the Union with the 12th Colored Heavy Artillery Unit and was stationed at Camp Nelson. We don't know about Mr. Bohannon's specific service, but African American soldiers at Camp Nelson performed garrison duties and saw action in several battles, including chasing the Confederate Army to Appomattox Courthouse. The closest action of the Civil War came in a skirmish in 1862 near what is now the intersection of US 42 and Dixie Highway. A group of Confederates seeking to threaten Cincinnati were engaged by a scouting party of Union soldiers. 1 Union soldier, 5 Confederate soldiers, and 1 civilian were killed, and the Southerners retreated out of the area. In 1865, Thomas Spencer Fisher deeded the land for the cemetery to the city of Florence, though as you can see by the dates, it had been used as a cemetery for many years. In 1874, Albert Price died and left money in his will to pave a road from his farm near what is now the airport to Florence. Most of the road has been removed or incorporated into Turfway Road, but there is still a small section named Price Pike connecting Shelby and Girard Streets. Almer Michael Yaley moved from Union County to Boone County in 1898 and married Lucy Ann Rouse. Mr. Yaley went on to be a teacher in Boone County for 41 years. He was the principal of Florence Public School and in 1911 established Florence High School, which is located just east of the cemetery. There is now an elementary school named for him in Florence. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, several residents of Boone County were involved, including Ralph Rhodes. Mr. Rhodes was a private in the Marine Corps and after the war became a machinist at the Acme Machine Tool Company. There are also many World War II veterans here in the Florence Cemetery. Some were killed in action, like Private Joe Taylor of the 81st Division, better known as the Wildcats. He was killed in the Battle of Angar in the Pacific Campaign in September 1944. Many others survived the war and returned to lives in Boone County, including Hubert Ryle, James Wilson, Richard Lucas, Roy Brooks, and many others. Albert Thomas Knox was one of several residents of Florence who served in the Korean War. Mr. Knox was a Sergeant First Class tank commander in the Army. After the war, he was a route salesman for Butternut Bread Company for 25 years, and in retirement drove a bus for Boone County schools. The 1950s and 60s were a time of huge population growth in Florence. At mid-century, there were 1,325 residents in the city. The population more than tripled by 1960, then doubled again to a total of 11,661 by 1970. Most of these people lived in newly built subdivisions. Wilhoit has been a prominent name in Boone County since the beginning, and Howard Ray Wilhoit Jr. served his family and his country in the Vietnam War. He was a rifleman in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was killed by small arms fire in Quang Nam, South Vietnam in 1968. These are just some of the interesting historical stories that can be found in the Florence Cemetery. History is all around you if you know where to look.